Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for All Our Yesterdays, which is episode 23 of season 3 of Star Trek The Original Series. This video is part of a series of videos where I review every episode of Star Trek The Original Series. In this video, I cover the episode All Our Yesterdays. So All Our Yesterdays is the episode where Kirk, Spock, and McCoy beam down to a planet that is about to be hit and destroyed by a supernova. However, a planet had a huge population of people that seemed to disappear, so they beam down to investigate it, and through their investigations they meet this mysterious library who shows them all these pictures of the past, and it turns out that the world's population had disappeared by traveling into their own past in order to destroy the supernova, and the librarian is mistaking Kirk, Spock, and McCoy for one of their inhabitants, is offering to do the same for them, which they don't realize as they step through the portal and travel back to various points in the past. Kirk travels back to a point that is reminiscent of the medieval Renaissance period of England, and Spock and McCoy travel back to an ice age 5,000 years ago. However, Mr. TOS was supposed to prepare them through this travel, whatever the hell it's called, in order for their bodies to adjust to the time period. He did not do that. Therefore, if they stay longer than a few hours, they will die. Kirk finds this out after he's accused of being a witch, and his judge, who's also from the future, helps him escape back into the present. However, McCoy and Spock, while in the Ice Age, almost freeze to death, and they meet up with a woman, Zarabeth, who was exiled there as a criminal, and she's very lonely and wants the company, and she fails to mention the part about them being prepared and simply tells them that they cannot go back or they will die, and Spock easily believes this, McCoy doesn't, and it creates tension between the two, as Spock is starting to revert to a more barbaric version of himself because he is 5,000 years in the past, and eventually McCoy convince him to get the truth out of Zarabeth, who admits that she only knows that she can't go back. She's not so sure about them. So they travel back to the time portal where Kirk is searching for them. They hear his voice, and they find out that they can in fact go back, and Spock has fallen in love with Zarabeth, and so tries to push McCoy back by himself. However, he can't go back unless they both go back, so that they do decide to go back together, where Spock has to abandon his love, and they get out just in the nick of time before the planet explodes. So, to me, this is really Star Trek, and it is what Star Trek does best. It does best these really interesting, really thought-provoking sci-fi concepts, and I think that is what I like best about Star Trek. That's why I gravitate towards episodes like that, like City on the Edge of Forever, which deals with time travel and alternate timelines, Mirror, which of course deals with parallel universes. The Alternative Factor also deals with parallel universes in an interesting way. What are some of my other favorite episodes? I don't know. The Changeling it poses the concept of what if a probe sent out from Earth is combined with this alien probe and wants to destroy Earth. So that's what I like first and foremost about Star Trek, I suppose. Well, that and interesting character stories, such as in City on the Edge of Forever, which has one of the best love stories, and you tells such a great, powerful, emotional character story with Kirk. So combined with that and the interesting sci-fi concepts, unlike episodes like, The Way to Eden, or Assignment Earth, or what else is there? Mud's Women, and Bread and circus is like, none of those are very interesting sci-fi concepts. I mean, they're kind of like bread and circus is like, what if the Romans, were still around in the 20th century, and then Assignment Earth was also dealing with interesting time travel concepts. They just do a shitty job at it. They don't accomplish it very well, which I covered when I covered those 2 episodes. This does do a really good job at it, and it's an interesting concept, and like City on the Edge, it deals with interesting character stories, particularly for Spock. So it is the recipe for a great Star Trek episode. It has that intriguing concept, great character stories. And so it's reminiscent of the best Star Trek episodes while being original, which is a great sort of caveat, because I just covered the Savage Curtain in my Revisited, which is the opposite of original, because it just takes from all the episodes. It did what Arena and Gamesters of Triskelion already did. It tries to do what Bread and Circuses did, but fails at it, and is solely unoriginal, and that is a problem of a lot of the season 3 episodes that I did not like And the Children Shall Lead. But this one is original, is fresh, which is why this is at the very end of season 3. It's the second to last episode of the entire show, the penultimate episode, one might say, and it's an original concept that is true to Star Trek and executed well. So that's why I would argue with people that say season 3 sucked, or that the end of season 3 sucked, because a lot of the noted writers, like D.C. Fontana, Gene Kuhn, all the people who made seasons 1 and 2 great, left by the second half of season 3, and it was left with a bunch of people who, not my words, but other people's words, do not understand Star Trek. And so that's why they say the last half of season 3 sucked, because the people running the show did not understand Star Trek. But I think there is some validity to the statement. I think that maybe Fred Freiberger and some of the other producers who were left did not, weren't around for the first 2 seasons, so they weren't the same as Star Trek. And I think the results were not bad. I think the results were mixed. I think that they would accept episodes that sucked, such as The Savage Curtain and The Way to Eden. In fact, The Way to Eden, I think they actively made worse, because the original script was written by D.C. Fontana, but they mutated it into something terrible. But something like The Savage Curtain and Turnabout Intruder, which was, to be fair, Roddenberry's baby, those ideas sucked to begin with, and they were just like, well, okay, we'll do them. And then again, they also did it with great ideas, great scripts, like Cloud Miners. This one. Now, Requiem for Methuselah was an interesting idea, maybe not executed to its best, but I still liked it. I still think it was interesting enough for me to like it. So I think the results for season 3 were mixed, particularly the end of season 3, not terrible. Because, as I talked about, the last 6 episodes of the original series, great episode, terrible episode, pretty good episode, absolute shit episode, awesome episode, and absolute shit episode. It goes back and forth. And so that's why I would say the end of season 3 is best described as not bad, but mixed. It's particularly the second half of season 3. And I, talked about in other videos how I think season 3 is better than season 2, and I hold to that, because I think the second half of season 2 was mostly terrible, with like 1 or 2 exceptions that were decent. So I think season 3 has a better track record than season 2. But again, that's just my opinion. I know everyone and their mother disagrees with me on this, but that's okay. So getting back more specifically to all our yesterdays, it's a very interesting concept, where people try to escape the supernova by escaping into the past, which means that their species, their planet, their history, their culture will die with the supernova. It's not like the people from the Inner Light who sent up a little probe to make sure that the history and their culture and the people are remembered, but they all die. So it's kind of, I guess, up to opinion who you think has it worse, because these people, at least, they don't die. They get to live out the rest of their lives, but their culture dies. Whereas in the Inner Light, those people are dead, but their culture survives. That is, if Picard has the nerve to actually freaking tell anyone about it, but that's another subject. So it's an interesting concept, or interesting comparing, sort of, in my mind, and sort of puts this episode a bit more in perspective. Now, here's the thing. Is this concept viable, of the entire population of this planet escaping into his own past? And here, because I had some people question the validity, and here's my response to that. If this is type 2 time travel, then the answer is no. If it's type 1 time travel, then the answer is yes. Now, I talked about these types of time travel, which I actually picked up from another YouTube channel. Type 1 is the whatever happened, the 12 monkeys sort of. You travel back in time and you do something. It was always done that way, and there's no possible way you can change the past. Type 2 is the sort of more traditional, which you see in more movies and shows, Back to the Future type, where if you travel back in time and you do something, you alter the future, and then now the future's changed and you can't get back into it until you restore the timeline by going back and correcting what that thing you altered was. Now, here's the thing. Star Trek has always, in majority of its time travel, has been depicted as type 2 time travel. And so I firmly stand by that Star Trek is type 2 time travel, and that there are a few examples that are type 1, and there's, Star Trek reboot BS 2009, which is a type 3 time travel. But I always dismiss those as being inconsistent with the franchise. Anything that's not depicted as purely type 2 is inconsistent with the franchise, because the vast majority of time travel shown in Star Trek is type 2. So, if I look at it from that perspective, then yes, this episode actually isn't viable. Because if it is type 2, and you have the entire population of a planet traveling back into its own past, it's just inevitable that someone's going to alter the timeline. It is unavoidable. Like in hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people traveling back into the past, there's no way no one is. And maybe you're going to get people, maybe they'll say, have rules like, oh, don't alter the timeline, but people are going to be whatever, and alter a timeline to make themselves rich and rulers and completely fuck with the timeline. And even unintentionally, you could have some butterfly effects. You could have someone steps on a butterfly, does something insignificant, or just walks down the street at a certain time, or does something that is innocuous and seems innocent and mundane, yet it has the unintentional side effects of completely changing the timeline. So, yes, if this is type 2 time travel, there would be all sorts of fucking with the timeline, and the whole planet would be a goddamn mess. But, so the only way this works is that it's type 1 time travel, which would, as I said, be inconsistent with the franchise. But then I can hand wave that away by saying, well, this is early in its creation. And so this is one of those exceptions that stick out with like a sore thumb, because they don't belong. Because if it is indeed type 1 time travel, then when they travel back into the past, they can't change anything, because they're always meant to do it. Any interactions they have with the people there were always meant to happen. It's always already a part of their recorded history. And so that would work. But yeah, it has to be inconsistent with the franchise in order for it to work. But that's my sort of headcanon, that this is one of those few out of place exceptions. They're actually using Type 1 time travel. Now, another interesting question, because I had someone pose this question on a review for this episode, and it really had me thinking, because they posed the question: if this was a real life scenario, if Earth was suddenly going to die, and that we had this ability to travel back into Earth's past, where would you want to go? And this particular person who posed the question said they'd rather die, because they're kind of fond of things like, running water and stuff like that. And so I was thinking about this long and hard, like, where in all of history would I like to go? And ultimately, I came to the same conclusion as this guy, is that I value my creature comforts and baths and stuff too much to want to live somewhere like, the Middle Ages or, ancient Egypt or something like that. And yeah, and also the lifespan was shorter. That's another thing to take into consideration now that I'm in my 40s. Is that, yeah, there were definitely shorter lifespans back then as well. And also there was and I try to think of all these different places throughout history, and I can think of, they're all plagued by war and slavery and aristocracy, dictatorships, and I'm like, I don't want to go back there. And so one possibility that I came up with was, because when I lived in New Zealand, I remember reading about what the island was like before humanity colonized it. And I'm even referring to the indigenous people, even before they did, is one of the last places on Earth that was touched by humans. I can't remember exactly. Maybe someone from New Zealand might be able to correct me, but I think the Maori originally came to New Zealand maybe 600 or 800 years ago, which in the span of things is not that long. And so they imagine what right now New Zealand has a lot of farms and a lot of just grasslands and stuff, but it used to be completely covered in forest, vibrant in birds. There's a couple of birds the moa is very legendary. It's like this big, ostrich-looking thing that went extinct, and had these giant falcons and stuff, and it was just completely covered in beautiful bush and forest. And I was thinking, wow, that would be cool to time travel back to there and see that. But then, as I thought about it, it would be interesting to visit, but not live and be stuck there, because then I would be like Zarabeth. Because I would be the only person in the entire freaking island, and I'd get very lonely, and I would have to have, like she did, I would have to have a particular shelter with all my creature comforts provided for me. Otherwise I would not be able to survive, and even then I would have to learn to hunt and cook my meat and stuff, and maybe I'd fuck with we're pretending this is Type 1 time travel, so I can't do any actual damage, but still. Ultimately, I decided that's not what I would want to do. And plus, that would also assume that the portal would be able to transport me to a different place and not just a different time, which they haven't specified in this episode. So, let's assume that it doesn't do that. That doesn't take you to a different place. Where if I travel back in time, I would have to remain on the East Coast of the United States. So, what would I like to do? As I thought about it, I think rather than simply die like this other guy chose, I think that I would want to go to the 1980s. Which I don't know if traveling back to a place that recent would be allowed. They didn't really specify this in this episode. If this is Type 1 time travel, then there's nothing I can really do to fuck with the timeline. So I don't see why it would be an issue. So I would travel back to the year 1980 specifically, and I would like get all this before when I would look up all the lottery numbers and the stock market and bullshit like that to become wealthy, or at least have a sizable income so that I would not have to work. Now, again, I don't know if that would be against the rules, but they never stated it was, so I'm just assuming it's not. Because, again, you can't alter any timelines because this is type 1 time travel. So, if I was rich, I was always meant to be rich. So, I would do that. And so we wouldn't have like a Back to the Future 2 situation. And unlike a Biff, I wouldn't just be turning myself into another Trump, because fuck that. I would actually just have enough money to travel, to live off without having to get a job. And I would travel the world. I would actually stay away from Maryland, where I grew up. I would stay away from my younger self, so I would even if it is type 1 time travel, I would risk no interactions with my younger self or anyone I knew. And I would go to other places, other parts of the U.S., and then after that, I would explore other parts of the countries of the world. Australia, New Zealand, I would go there, and maybe even Asia, Africa, stuff like that. Well, I don't know, parts of Africa. Because, again, I wouldn't want to put myself in too much danger, because I know, but I would know the history. I'm more familiar with the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s. I would know the history of everything that was going, and it would be interesting to, see some of this music, some of the live concerts of these bands that I was too young to do, to see some of these movies in the theater for the first time. I don't know, this is where my mind went. And then by the time we got back to 2023, if I was still alive, I would be in my higher 80s. So by that time, I would be like, well, I'll just die with the supernova. Because I'd be like nearly 90 years old and I would have lived a full life. So that's my answer. That's what I would do. I don't know if any of you would like to put in the comments if you want to think about it, what you would do. But I think it is an interesting concept. Now, getting back to this episode of Star Trek, which I feel like I've diverted from. I heard the criticism about this episode that particularly the timeline that Kirk went to is too Earth-like. Because if you follow my review, something I complained about, particularly with Season 2, is that Enterprise just encounters another alien planet way out in the galaxy that happens to be exactly like Earth. Like, I complained about this in Bread and Circuses, where they traveled to a planet where they specifically stated they were speaking English, so it wasn't the universal translator, and that there were Romans, and there were Catholics and people believed in God, and there was TV that was just like the one in the 60s. It was basically a 20th century Rome. Exactly how it would have played out on Earth, and they use those terms, Romans, whatnot. And then you have the Make It Glory, where there just so happened to be another planet where there were Yankees and communists, and they played out exactly as they did on Earth, and they even had the American flag and the American Constitution exactly the same as it was here. And Miri, where it was the exact duplicate of Earth. They made very clear that the geography and everything was exactly the same, just so happened to be there. And everything was exactly like 1960s Earth. And then, whatever. Then there's episodes like A Piece of the Action and, I'm trying to think of the other one. But there, an example of A Piece of the Action, it's, Patterns of Force, where they had Nazis. Piece of Action had the 1940s gangsters, and Patterns of Force had Nazis. However, in both of those examples, they were at least not lazy enough to come up with an excuse as to why these alien worlds would look exactly like Earth, because it was from contamination coming from someone from Earth, like with a piece of the action, some starship accidentally left a book behind about mobsters that all these aliens modeled their society off of. And in Patterns of Force, you had a guy from the Federation who purposely decided it would be a great idea to recreate Nazi Germany on this planet. And I talked about how ridiculous that motivation was. But anyway, and even in those examples, even though they came up with a BS excuse, it doesn't explain why every single thing, especially in the case of the PC action, like all the telephone poles, all the street lamps, the design, every last detail was exactly the same as the way it was on Earth. So those are still BS. So my point is, I've heard the criticism, and I rail against all that was bullshit. I hated it. I do not like those episodes because of those. Now, I heard people apply that to this episode. Now, this is where I disagree. I don't think this episode applies. I don't think it is in that same category as the other episodes. Now, the reasoning they would give is because when Kirk travels back to this time, it's very similar to the Renaissance or medieval times of England or whatever, and they talk about witches and witchcraft and they had the people dressing using swords and sort of dressing in similar costumes, and it's supposed to be this alien world, but I actually disagree. I don't think this is an exact recreation, duplication of Earth the way those other episodes were. For one thing, they never mention any specific things from Earth's history like Romans or Nazis or mobsters. They don't mention anything by name that is very specific. And they never say it's exactly like Earth. And in fact, this history that Kirk travels to is kind of an amalgamation of different periods of history. It's like these guys are kind of dressed like the Three Musketeers, which was more French. But the woman is speaking more English. The judge, it looks more like early North American, like New England type judge, and they talk about witches and burning witches, which is more of, again, I know they did do this in Europe as well, but the way it's presented in this episode is more reminiscent of the Salem witch trials and whatnot in Massachusetts. So it's like they're taking all these amalgamations of all these different things and making a past that's similar. Maybe some people might argue a bit too similar, and that's fair, but I don't really think so. But different than Earth. And this is something that a lot of science fiction, and Star Trek in particular, does a lot, and I don't have any issue with it. I would make the direct comparison to the Voyager episode Blink of an Eye, which pretty much everyone agrees, most people do, this is a great episode. And in that episode, Voyager watches the historical, the development of a civilization come to pass. And you see a lot of things that are very similar to Earth. You see the earlier time periods is really, similar, like, the medieval times. And then you see a situation that's very similar to 20th century Earth with the scientific telescope and stuff like that. But in those situations, it's similar, but not exactly the same. It's saying that these alien worlds are developing on a similar line to Earth, but not exactly the same. And that I could buy. And so I didn't have an issue with that in the blink of an eye, and I don't have an issue with that here. I think that maybe it is a little bit too similar to Earth, but I think it's done that way so the audience can identify. Because really, it's really hard. The more I think about it, it's a really hard concept to tackle. They're on an alien world. How exactly would an alien world history look like and how would they develop. In fact, we see this in like the Enterprise episode. I can't even remember the name of it, but the one where they went to a pre-warp society. It was the society was reminiscent, very similar to like 19th century Earth or something like that. Now, the reason why I think this may be more off-putting to people is that these aliens look exactly like humans. There's no makeup or anything, whereas other episodes they at least bothered to put like shit on their forehead to make them look more alien. But if you look just like at their society and the way that they're behaving, it is very similar to Earth, but it's not exact duplicates the same way those other episodes of TOS are. So therefore, I think this episode, All Our Yesterdays, even though these aliens aren't wearing makeup, it still applies more to those other episodes like Blink of an Eye or that Civilization. That's the name of the Enterprise episode. It applies more to episodes like that. Or even, you could even put Who Watches the Watchers in that same category, because the Mintakans are very similar to, early Earth cultures. So I think you could show that belongs more in the category with those episodes, which I have no issue with, and it does not belong in the category with the episodes that are exact Earth. Here's Nazis, here's Romans. I think they're totally different things. So I'm okay with this episode, but I hate those other ones. So that's that is my long explanation for that. So, and I never thought about it this way, because all the stuff like the Miri and the bread and circuses and Pattern of the Force, I always thought of them that way, but I never thought of this episode that way until someone pointed it out. And I had to think about and articulate and analyze why, and that's why, because I don't think it belongs there. But anyway, so the Kirk storyline's okay. It's not why I love this episode, but I think it adds a nice texture. Moreover, I like the fact that they separate Kirk, Spock, and McCoy, and that the main focus of the episodes is actually Spock and McCoy. They're the emotional backbone of the episode, which I like. I think that's very original. In fact, I had someone refer to this episode as Spock sitting on the edge of forever, which is not quite as good as that, I will say. But yes, it is along the same lines, where Spock meets and falls in love with a romance that you totally buy. It totally works. And he has to give that romance up. And it is kind of sad and tragic at the end. And I think that really works. So, yeah, I think that's powerful. And the Kirk storyline, I think, is just... It's better to drive the story forward. I think that's why it's necessary. Like the stuff with him being called a witch or whatever, it's just him being a conundrum. But it's mainly about he learns about not being prepared and how to go back to the library. And once he's there, he has to use TOS to try to retrieve Spock and McCoy before the sun goes nova. And so it creates this really effective, really great time crunch and level of tension that drives the episode. So it's definitely necessary. But the Spock storyline, I think, develops really well. I think where he, is starting to lose himself because he's in the past. He's becoming more animalistic, and it develops this romance with this woman where he wants to stay. And I would go as far. In fact, this would probably be very evident from my perspective, but a lot of other people may find this shocking or disagree with this, but that this is the best Spock romance in TOS, that this is way better than that episode, This Side of Paradise, which a lot of people try to promote as a great way of exploring Spock's character and what it was like for his romance and him having to give up that romance. And I do agree that the breakup scene in that episode was really strong, but the rest of the episode was terrible, and it was a shitty analogy for marijuana. And so that episode did not work, whereas this episode does. Because I definitely buy this romance a hell of a lot more, and I buy the fact that Spock is, and in fact, rather than Spock choosing to break up with her as he did in This Side of Paradise, he is forced to leave her behind, and the effect that has on him, even though he's a Vulcan, very effective. And this is sort of does the Spock and McCoy relationship better than Season 2 did. This is something I talked about before. I think it's handled better in Season 3 than it was in Season 2. And this is another example of that, how they do come to blows. But that's because, Spock's reverting to this more primal state, and McCoy tries to bring him out of that. And at first Spock is desperate to save his friend's life, and I do like how when McCoy calls him "you green-blooded Vulcan," and he pins him up against the wall, and it's I don't like that. I don't think I ever did, and now I'm sure, which is true. It really addresses the fact that McCoy is constantly racist to Spock, and as he finally stands up for himself because he's in this more primal state, and is hey, stop being such a racist dick. and I think that was a powerful scene. But then McCoy is able to, after he calms down, is able to reason with Spock, is able to talk him out of it. It's you just accepted her version of events so easily because you want it to be true, because you want to stay here. And that was powerful. That was done extremely well, and as I said, the tragedy of him having to leave her behind, pushing McCoy through the portal, but it didn't work, and then having to cup, her head in his hands, and say, "I'm sorry, I have to leave. I really want to stay, but I can't let my friends die just to stay here." He's conscionable enough to not do that, and I do buy that he would be willing to stay with her. So, yeah, I think this is a very, maybe not as powerful as Sitting on the Edge, I will grant that, but it is still a very powerful love story. And it's very effective, and you feel for Spock when he leaves. Now, this episode is not without flaws, however. There are a couple of flaws that I think do exist. The biggest one, I think, is the passage of time, because when Kirk, Spock, and McCoy first beam down to the planet at the start of the episode, Kirk states in his captain's log they have about 3 hours to the supernova, and then when Kirk is in the past and he meets that judge who's from the future, when Kirk reveals he wasn't prepared, the judge is "Well, you must return at once. You can only survive in the past for a few hours." So they clearly established that they only have a few hours, and that's assuming that the time in the past is not relative, that because of the portal exists and it connects these two time frames, and the portal exists in linear time. So in other words, if Spock and McCoy are back in the past for 3 hours, that means that 3 hours in the future, or the present where TOS is, also pass, because the portal solidifies that passage of time, which is unlike the episode Past Tense in Deep Space Nine, which tried to do a similar thing, but that logic made zero sense and was just nonsense. But here it actually works. So, if we were to assume that means the storyline with Spock and McCoy takes place over 3 hours, that Spock falls in love and is able to abandon his whole life for meeting someone that he only knew for literally 3 hours, or less than 3 hours. And McCoy got frostbite and was near death, and he was lying in bed and recovered eventually and healed, and was healed enough to go back out into freezing cold within a span of 3 hours. That's not really how frostbite works. And so, honestly, all the times that I watched this episode in the past, I just, without thinking about it, I just instinctually assumed that the storyline with Spock and McCoy took place over a period of months, because that's how they played out, and that would make a lot more sense for Spock and Zarabeth's time frame. Now, you could try to say, well, maybe time is relative. Maybe the portal doesn't connect the times that precisely, and maybe time passes more slowly in the past. Maybe a month equals an hour in the future. But then there's that line from the judge who says, well, you can't survive more than a few hours in the past if you weren't prepared, which Spock and McCoy were not. So why are they still alive if it's been months for them? So that whole thing is a giant flaw. It is a mistake, and I would like to headcanon in a way to say that time's not relative, but then there's that other thing about being prepared, which is also inconsistent, so I have to hand wave that away as well. So it becomes too big of a flaw to just simply ignore. So unfortunately, that is a flaw. And plus, the whole time travel logic they use about the having to be prepared in order to survive in the past is also very inconsistent with how time travel's been portrayed in Star Trek, where people can go back and live in the past and stay in the past and be perfectly fine. Now, you could say it's specific to this planet, or maybe specific to those people, in which case Spock could have stayed in the past without dying. But I don't know. That still seems like more plot convenience, a way to make it so that Spock couldn't stay in the past, and how they thought that they had to stay in the past at first. But I think the episode's really well written, as it sets up the I haven't prepared, where it shows TOS going, I haven't prepared you. And that is the line that sets up. And I also love the way it's disseminated. Unlike a lot of season 3 episodes of TOS, because I will admit, one of the major flaws I've been noticing in TOS season 3 is that they love to hold your hand, and they love to exactly spell it out, beat you over the head with exactly what's happening, instead of trusting their own audience to figure it out. But in this episode, they actually do trust their own audience to figure it out. They don't really explain what's going on at first, and at first you have no idea. And in fact, TOS, the language he uses is maybe a bit too vague. But when I think about it, it would make sense, if the entire planet already knew that they were traveling to people's past. It doesn't seem like it's something he would have to explain to random people going in. It's just assumed everyone already knows this. So that could explain that away, but it is a bit convenient for the plot that he would talk in such vague terms when Kirk, Spock, and McCoy would ask specific questions like, where did these people go? And he would come up with vague answers like, well, wherever they wanted to go, of course, instead of saying they traveled back in the past. But still, it was an example of how this, this episode didn't treat you like an idiot. It didn't find a way, and it dropped little nuggets oh, you haven't been prepared, and it doesn't really explain that until later, and they don't fully explain that they've actually traveled into the past until later. At first Kirk thinks that the library is just over there and not even realizing that he's in the past. And I love it's just, I think it's just written well. It's just a really good, well written episode. Now, I think I do have to bring up some of the B canon, because I remember reading this book called Yesterday's Sun about Spock actually had impregnated Zarabeth before he left, and that she had a child that lived out, with her in the cave. And I think he uses the Guardian of Forever. He uses some sort of method to travel back in time when his son is an adult and after Zarabeth has passed away, and bring him back into the present to be with him. And this causes this whole other thing. And then there was even a sequel to this, which I can't remember what that was called. And I don't remember these books very well, so I don't even remember what happened. All I remember is the premise, which that is an interesting premise, though. I think, that is actually a very fascinating premise, that Spock actually had a son with Zarabeth. But yeah, I don't know. I just had to throw that in there as well. So that is pretty much all I have to say about this episode. Is very thought-provoking, very powerful, and for the most part executed extremely well, and pretty emotionally powerful as well. So now, let me read some of my Patreon comments. Of course, first I have to thank my patrons for supporting me on Patreon. Of course, very much appreciated. It really helps the channel to thrive. So we have Chuck Hooks, Kyrie091, Anthony D. Benedictus, Ricky, Manny Jester, Joel Valls, Brian A., Alessandro Migalacio, Norman Buckwald, Stephen Kennedy, Brenton Berg, Allison Fordyce, and Brandon Neal Howes. Thank you all so very much for your support. So we got a few comments on this episode from the Patreon supporters. First comment is from Ricky, who says, in my humble opinion, this is the best episode of the third season of TOS. I've always considered this as such a criminally underrated episode that nobody talks about. First of all, I believe that this is the best Spock episode in the show, and it is incredibly refreshing that it was Spock having a love interest and not Kirk. I totally bought the romance, and I found it quite heartbreaking when Spock had to leave the woman whom he loved behind. I also love the time travel aspect of this episode, and I believe that the time travel logic alternations to alternations to stay at a certain time period was fascinating, as Spock's behavior was subtly changing in the ice timeline, for it was the time before Vulcans adapted into a more logical behavior. The Kirk part of the episode was pretty good, not as strong as Spock and McCoy's story, but I still enjoyed it. It was still quite fun and entertaining to watch. Even though this isn't a grand or the most complex story, I love it, and every time I watch this episode, every time I watch this, my opinion of this episode always goes higher. This is in my top 10 TOS episodes, and I think it's a hell of a lot better than other episodes like Space Seed or A Piece of the Action. To me, this is a masterpiece, and my rating is a 10, the best. Hear, hear. Definitely better than Space Seed and A Piece of the Action. I'll second that. Anyway, I don't know why I drank to that. But anyway, next comment is from Matty Jester, who says, I've always really liked this episode. I wish it was the series finale. The show going out with a bang, literally. It's got an interesting sci-fi idea, escaping into the planet's past to avoid disaster. The Voyager book Escape has some similar ideas, people traveling back and forth through their own planet's long history. Spock has plenty to do here, and it's really sad that he can't stay with Zarabeth and she can't come with him. What a lonely fate for both of them. I like the memorable Mr. Atos too, with his slightly odd demeanor and obsession in saving others from the Nova. All in all, very good penultimate episode of Star Trek that sticks with you long afterwards. I wish there was more like this one. 9 out of 10. Yeah, Atos I forgot to mention about. This is something I didn't realize till someone pointed out to me. A to Z. He's a librarian. I always like that. But yeah, he was a good character. And the Voyager book Escape, I actually read that book too. And also it's a similar but different sci-fi premise, which I also found fascinating. So I did actually kind of like that book. The one thing I will say when Maddie says I wish this was the series finale, this is something I'll talk about when I do my revisited for Turnabout Intruder, is that Star Trek, the original series, has no series finale. In fact, from what I understand, most shows in the 60s did not. Because I distinguished the last episode of the show from a series finale. I think a series finale is different. A series finale is created to finalize the show, to wrap up the show, to be the final episode, to wrap up all the storylines and end the show. Whereas, like, Turnabout Intruder is not that. In fact, they didn't even know that was going to be the last show when they were shooting it. They found out as they were shooting it, that they were canceled and it would be the last show. So it's not a series finale. It just so happens to be the last episode before the show got canceled. So if I were ever to do a countdown saying my favorite or least favorite series finales of Star Trek, I would not include TOS in it because it doesn't have a series finale. But on the other hand, I do agree that it would be better if All Our Yesterdays was the last episode and not Turnabout Intruder. It had one of the best episodes as opposed to the singular worst episode of the entire show be the last episode. It would have ended on a higher note. So the next comment is from Brandon Neilhouse, who says, All Our Yesterdays, a dodgy title. It sounds like a soap opera, but a good episode nonetheless. I don't understand why the Enterprise is waiting less than 24 hours before they check up on this planet. Mr. Atos, ha ha ha. Well, that's a funny joke, I don't think. Kirk in the Musketeer Land is not all that interesting, and the woman tries to help. I'm still trying to work out what the hell she's trying to say. McCoy and Spock in the Ice Age is way more interesting, and Spock finally calls McCoy out for being a bigot. I cannot help wondering why McCoy didn't revert to a primitive state as well. I like Zarabeth. She has just the right amount of wonder and naivete. I think she and Spock make a good pair. I enjoy their love story. Zarabeth's cave must be really well heated by those hot springs to allow her to wear that skimpy tunic, but we all know it was just Gene Roddenberry being a perv. This episode was written by the woman who wrote Is There in Truth No Beauty, and yes, she was a librarian. This story is reminiscent of City on the Edge of Forever, and more so to me, the Voyager episode Displaced. 8 mini CD-ROMs out of 10. The Voyager episode Displaced. That's the one where the people were trying to, these aliens were suddenly appearing and the Voyager crew was disappearing. By the end of the episode, they were in these habitats that were made just for them. I don't know. I never thought of that episode when I think of this episode. I don't really know the connection. I suppose there was a scene when they went into this habitat that was like a frozen wasteland. That's how they defeated the enemies, because they were very sensitive to the cold. But I guess, and then B'Elanna and Tom almost froze to death. I don't know. I guess it's kind of similar, I suppose, but I get the City on the Edge Forever because I already talked about that, how that was kind of similar. But I may suggest that it's not Roddenberry who was the perv, although he is a perv. But I think all the producers, and particularly Fred Freiberger, who was quoted as saying that Star Trek was just tits and ass in space. So, yeah, he might have something to do with it, but yeah, it's the whole 60s thing. So anyway, my rating for All Our Yesterdays out of 10 is a 9. Excellent. Not quite a 10 because of the flaws I mentioned about he was only in the past for 3 hours, and the whole thing about having to be prepared was a bit silly. And also, I didn't mention this, but Spock reverting back to his earlier Vulcan just because he's 5,000 years in the past. I'm a bit iffy about that too. But if I hand wave those things away, it is still a great episode. It's a great premise. It's a great original concept. It's really true to Star Trek. That does what Star Trek does best. And it does it to tell interesting character stories. It had that interesting, there was intense suspension, and the plot was written very well, constructed well, and it was driving you to this conclusion. It had you engaged and on the edge of your seat, and also an emotional impact of Spock falling in love and having to leave his love behind. As I said, there are a few things you have to hand wave away, which is why it doesn't get a 10 from me, but it's a very strong 9. This is, in fact, one of my favorite episodes of the original series. Absolutely love it. So that is it. That is it, guys. This is it. This is the end of my coverage of Star Trek, the original series. This is the last new video I have recorded for the original series, because the only thing left is the episode Turnabout Intruder, which I have already covered. So yes, I will be covering that on a Revisited for my Patreon supporters. So if you are a Patreon supporter, you will get that. But this is the last new video. This is it as far as the new coverage I have for the original series. So at this point, I have in fact covered the entirety of the original series. I did it. So, yes, tomorrow I will be releasing that Revisited for a Turnabout Intruder for my Patreon supporters. And then on Saturday, I'll start concluding my coverage of the original series with my top 10 best episodes of the original series. This will be a very short, succinct video, trying to aim for it to be like 4 or 5 minutes long. It's going to be more geared towards general audiences to try to attract people to my channel, if I'm being completely honest. And then on Monday, I'm going to do the same thing, but with my top 10 worst episodes of the original series, which again will be very short and succinct. Now, as of the recording of this video, I do not know when I will be doing a live stream where I'm going to count down your top 10 favorite episodes and top 10 least favorite episodes of the original series. But by the time I upload this video, I should know when. So I will put a link in the description, and I'll probably write when it is in the description, so you can look at the description and it will tell you when that live stream is going to be, and I have a link to it so you can click on it. I'll be doing a live stream with my sister Alyssa, and I'm going to tally all the submissions that I got, which at this stage that I'm recording this, which is I believe 2 weeks in advance from its release, I have about 6 or maybe 7 submissions, and so I would like more. But by this stage, it will be very close to when they have to be totaled. But you have up until when that live stream is going to be to submit. So if you haven't submitted it yet, you can just get it in under the wire before that live stream, and it will be added. And I'm going to total everyone's submissions of their top 10 favorite and least favorite episodes of the original series, and do a live stream where I reveal the results. And I'm very interested to see what those results will be. And I have no idea when right now when that live stream is going to be, but as I said, just check the description, it will tell you. And then on Tuesday, I'm actually going to release one of my Revisited videos that I did for my Patreon supporters to the public, for everyone can get a taste, a sample of what I've been doing over on Patreon. And I chose what I think is the best. For me, it was down to the two Revisiteds that I really put my heart into, that I think really turned out really well, were City on the Edge of Forever and The Alternative Factor. But I chose to go with City on the Edge of Forever because I wasn't that happy with my actual review to it. So I'm going to, if you're not a Patreon supporter, if you haven't seen it in my Revisited, Tuesday I will release City on the Edge of Forever Revisited for everyone on my channel to see. And then Wednesday I am going to start, speaking of taking Patreon videos and releasing to the public, I'm going to start doing that for the animated series. So I'm not going to cover again the animated series like I did for the original series. Instead, because I already covered every single episode of the animated series about 3 years ago. Has patron only videos. I did 2 episodes per video, and I will be releasing those videos one day at a time to the public. So it will be on my channel, on my main page. That Star Trek episode reviews list that's always at the top of my page, I'll add every time I make a TOS video public. I'll add it to that playlist, and also I will also have its own the animated series playlist, which I'll add all these episodes to as I make them public. So I will make every review I did for the animated series public one day at a time. And then on Thursday, I will start my weekly reviews for Strange New Worlds, which will start. So those will be the only new reviews coming out as I've released all these animated series episodes. But if you're not a Patreon supporter, then these animated series reviews will be new to you because you wouldn't have seen them before, even though I recorded them like 3 years ago. But so the only videos for me I'll be recording new will be the Strange New Worlds reviews. And then when we get to the end of June, I'll start covering the movies, which again I already covered, so these are going to be revisited videos back over on Patreon. For my Patreon supporters, I'll cover Star Trek 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then I'm going to start my coverage in July of Star Trek Next Generation, which will start with, again, another revisited for Encounter at Farpoint, since I already covered Encounter at Farpoint. But back all the way until July 10th, so a bit over a month from now, I'll finally return with new videos twice a week or 3 times a week, as the case may be, for Star Trek Next Generation. And then we'll start on July 10th with a new video for The Naked Now. So that is what is to come. And the following month for Enchantment of Eternity. So please be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching. Yay, I did it!